Hi everyone, welcome to the new orange tutorial. This is how we're gonna paint this orange, the reference photo on the left top corner. I'm using masking fluid for this painting because I don't want to necessarily skip every little white part of the painting. So for this painting, the masking fluid will just help us to keep all those highlights or white parts white of the orange that we don't want to paint in. So I'm using an old brush with masking fluid. You can use any brand you prefer. I just happen to have this brand, which I found at the local art store, and it does the same thing. So with the old brush, you can definitely get away by just painting it on. I'm going to add it quite thick. And you'll see I'll just paint it on every little section that we want to keep white. We might do a layer of watery orange over that section that's too white, but for now, we just want to keep it all clean and bright. So I'm not going to paint all the little white spots in exactly. I'm just going to add little the masking fluid until certain areas where I want to keep those little white dots. Even in between the orange on the little segments, you can see there's a few little highlighted pieces. And that will make such a difference to the end result of your orange because it will make it look 3D. So just drop in a few little pieces of the white. You'll see you'll see that I'll add a little bit more white little dots in between where the segments are of the orange. And for this painting, the masking fluid is going to help so much because you will have to try and keep all of those little white parts white or highlighted or light throughout the painting, which is just going to take so much time. This is just so much faster. I know a lot of watercolor artists don't always like to use masking fluid, but for this painting it really helps, and it will just make it look so much better and cleaner. So here I'm just dropping in some masking fluid drops to cover the paper. Now if you paint over those little dots, you will see they will stay white, and you will have to wait for the paint to dry before you remove all of these little dots of the masking fluid. And you'll see I add it quite thick because if you add it too thin, it's very difficult to remove, and sometimes a little bit stays behind on the paper. So I just add it quite thick on the paper, which will make it a lot more easier to remove later on. So again, this is the brand I'm using. You can use whichever brand you want to use. And when you're done, take a holder with water and rinse your brush. Make sure you wash it immediately because it will dry on your brush. You will never be able to use that brush necessarily again. But I just added some clean water, and I'm just cleaning my brush right now, and I'm just going to wipe it with a tissue to remove all of that residue, which is very similar to like a glue. It's very sticky because obviously I want to use this brush again. I don't want to throw it away. I'm just going to drop in some orange on my palette now. I've just got a little square plate and I'm using fresh paint. I'm not using an old palette of mine where I already have all the paint squeezed out on. This is fresh watercolor paint, and it will also just make the painting look so much brighter when you use fresh paint on a plate. So I'm using orange. You can use whichever orange you prefer, and I'm using a yellow from Daniel Smith. And I'm just using a little bit of sap green for the top part of that orange where the stem used to be. Just want to move the plate so you can see all the colors. So you just need a little bit, because you can, as you paint and you finish your painting, you can just add a little bit more paint on your plate. So that's how little paint you need to finish this orange. You might add a little bit more, and I might add in a little bit of red later to make it darker if the orange is not bright enough. But for now, these are the colors that I'm going to use. This brush is a number 5 or a 4. You can use either a 4, 5 or a 6, and it's a round brush. I just switched the light on because it's starting to become quite dark. So my brush is wet, and I'm just going to wet the paper. So we are going to drop in the pigment everywhere where I wet the paper right now. So take your time and make sure there's no puddles of water. So I've got water on my brush, and I'm just going to pick up some yellow. As you can see, it's quite a thick consistency, so it's not too watery. Now just drop in the pigment where you wet the paper earlier. And you'll see that the pigment does not go into or get absorbed into the paper where you painted on the masking fluid. It's quite a nice bright yellow that I'm using here. All the colors that I'm using I will mention on the supplies list provided with this painting. So the consistency is slightly watery, but not that watery. So I'm showing you on the palette so that you can do exactly what I do. And I'm just going to drop in the pigment around that section where the stem used to be. So the masking fluid is preventing the pigment from being absorbed into the paper. And I just want to keep that highlighted section white as well. I didn't put masking fluid there, so I just have to be careful because I don't want to paint over that section there. So we still have the whole family here during lockdown, and it's a bit noisy. So if you hear any noises, the whole family is still home. And I'm trying to do this voiceover for this orange. You also hear there's a bird here by the window, so I can't tell him to move, but it's quite nice background music. So this yellow will shine through when we add a little bit of the orange over this section later. So we first want to put down a layer of this yellow to shine through, because these are all translucent watercolors that I'm using on this painting. Also, that section there, I want to keep the highlight open, and I didn't put any masking fluid there because we are going to paint in it later. That's the top part of the orange. That's going to be a little bit of the green that we will add in the sap green. So, and I want certain sections will be lighter, so you can just follow what I'm doing or check the reference photo and just paint according to what you want to add on your orange. And I'm just using a much thicker consistency here. And you can see on the plate my consistency is very thick of this yellow, the New Camboge from Daniel Smith. And again, you can use whichever bright yellow you have. You don't have to use the same colors that I'm using here. And we will soften all of those colors, going back to that size 5 brush of mine, so you can use a round brush, which is the one where we will just move the pigment around on our orange. And we don't want to paint into the green section that we're going to for the stem, where the stem used to be, so we want to leave that white at this stage. Keep your lines and edges quite clean and straight there, and just let the paint do what it's supposed to do. I love watercolor paint. So also want to keep that section quite light, because that's a highlighted section, and again that will make such a difference to your orange. I love painting fruit in watercolor. It's so much fun. Painting fruit's quite easy and it's quick. So when you're a beginner, those are the things that you should focus on and paint all the time. If you want to learn how to paint in watercolor, paint fruits and, you know, little petals, flowers with not too many petals. Those are the things that will really teach you how to paint in watercolor, because you can make a mistake, but you don't have to throw a whole painting away if you do make a mistake. So a fruit or a vegetable is quite easy and quite quick to paint. And that's the stuff that I used to paint when I started painting in watercolor more often. I'm just dropping in the paint, more pigment, and you will see where the masking fluid is that the pigment does not get absorbed in the paper. So I'm just gonna get my Raphael brush, number 2. It's quite a big brush and it holds quite a lot of water. I'm just gonna wet this section of the orange, and I noticed there's some pigment on my brush. I just want to pick it up with some tissue paper. Let me just rinse my brush before we start again. It looks like it's clean now. And I notice even though I rinse it, there's still a bit of pigment there, so I just want to dab it with my tissue to lift up most of the pigment. I don't mind a little bit of red, but I don't want it to shine through the yellow that I'm going to put down now. I'm just trying to get the pigment out of my brush. Just want to clean it properly. So I'm going to wet the yellow again, and we're just going to drop in that color like that. So use quite a big brush for this section that you want to just drop in the color, because you will not go into painting to the highlights because you've got masking fluid. So you can just paint, drop in that color. It's beautiful. Look how it's flowing. Just move the pigment around. Wipe off the excess water, because we don't want the paper to buckle too much, but we also don't want hard lines. I'm just going to wait for this section to dry now. Do you see the masking fluid there? If we remove that, all of that's going to be white, and that's what we want. I'm going to use my number 5 comb brush. It's a very nice point. Make sure the paint is dry before you drop any pigment in. Rather, wait for the paper to dry before you paint over sections that are still wet. So I'm going to start on this section because the left-hand orange is still very wet and I don't want to disturb the pigment there now. So I'm going to leave some highlight sections open here. So I'm just going to paint around all the sections that I want to leave white. Just making little circles around the highlights. And this brush has a very nice point. We also wanted that there's a little bit of masking fluid there, so that will prevent the pigment to go into that section that I also want to keep white. Just make little sections of white. I should have put masking fluid there, but I didn't, so I'm just going to paint around that. I'm just going to move the brush around those little sections so it does not leave a very hard line. That's going to be a highlight area. There's a masking fluid there. So as you can see, it stays white and the pigment just moves away from it. So I'm just taking some of that yellow that I have on my plate with a little bit of the orange, and now we're just going to add some of the detail. Just want to take my time and look at the reference photo, and you basically want to add everything that you can see on the reference photo, but you don't have to follow it exactly. So I can feel that the paper is dry. And we're just gonna add some of the detail. Just want to get the right consistency of color and the right color. Just want to mix a little bit more of the orange and the yellow together. And I want to show you the color that I have there. So it's a little bit of the red, yellow and orange. All the colors are mentioned on the supplies list with the attachments. So we're wetting that section and we're just going to drop in the pigment. You'll also see that the yellow will still shine through all the orange that we add onto the paper. I don't want to speed up these videos because I want to show you the real-time videos, so you're welcome to fast forward these little videos if you want to, if you don't want to see certain sections. But these are for beginners, so I would like them to see exactly what I do and why I wait for the pigment to dry on the paper before we paint over the wet paper. You also don't want to disturb the pigment. I'm just going to wet that section with my round number 5 brush. So everywhere where you wet the paper, the pigment will flow. Where there's no water on the paper, the pigment will just stay put and it will not move. So I'm just taking tissue and I'm just going to dab up some of the pigment there because I want to leave that highlight area light. And you just take your brush and with clean water on and just wet that section again. And as you can see, I lift up quite a lot of pigment. I don't want any paint there at the moment. Now we're just going to leave it to dry. I'm just softening some of those lines with my clean brush. So that's a little bit more of a red color. I've also mixed in a little bit more of a red in with the pigment. It's a little bit of pyrrole scarlet, very translucent color. But it's not that watery and it's not too thick, so it's in between. We're just going to move the pigment around slowly with your brush and let the watercolor do what it's supposed to do. That section will of course stay white for now. I just love this color that's coming through with the mixes of colors now. So I'm just taking the number 5 brush and we're just going to wet the pigment because we want that section to stay light. So just take your brush and lift up the pigment there. Take a tissue and dab off most of the excess of the pigment. Now leave it to dry. I just want to take my time and see where I have to add in the darker section of the orange. The paper is a bit dry now. I just want to remove that little piece of orange that's at the bottom there, so I'm just taking a flat brush that I wet in clean water. I'm just going to soften that line slightly and dab it up with a clean tissue. And voila, it's clean. I just want to feel if that's dry, because we're going to add in all those little lines on the orange that we can see on the reference photo. I'm going to use a very small fine brush here. It's about a 1 or a 2. Make sure your paper is dry. I'm just adding in a little bit more of the red, orange red color, and I'm just mixing it with the pigment already on the palette, which is the orange with the yellow. Now remember, this is fun, so just take your time and paint what you see on the reference photo. So you can either add in all of these details, or if you don't want to, if you prefer not to, you don't have to. So I'm also mixing in a little bit of the burnt sienna in there, because it's like a brownish orangey red color. And I'm just taking my time and I'm adding in that line that I can see on the reference photo, and I will soften that line with a brush. Just wetting my big brush, and I'm just going to soften that. There you go. I'm going to add in a little bit more red in there. Now this will make the orange look 3D, so take your time and add in all this detail and soften the line. You don't want the line to be too prominent and too dark. Sure, the wind is howling outside. I'm just checking on the reference photo because I want to add all of these lines that's supposed to be there, because this, as you can see now, the orange is starting to look quite 3D. I'm just adding in that little line that I can see on the reference photo, and it's burnt sienna with the orange and the yellow, just a mix. And I'm softening the line with my big brush that I just dipped in water and wiped on a tissue. So that little corner I want to make slightly darker. It's like a little fold in the orange. And I'm just going to do it on the other side as well. I like to use a big brush to soften these hard lines, because it will not lift up the pigment at the bottom of that's already down on the paper. Sometimes small little brushes can lift up the pigment, so just use a slightly bigger brush just to lift up or soften your. You don't want to lift up the pigment. I just said I don't want to lift up the pigment, but just use a big brush to soften your hard lines, to prevent you from picking up your pigment on your paper that's already that you already put down. I'm just going to soften that line that we just added in there. That was burnt sienna mixed with the orange, red and the yellow on the palette or my plate. I'm just going to add a little drop more orange in there to brighten up that color. With a little bit more red. And then a little bit more orange, just to get the perfect color. So we're just going to add that line to show where the one orange end and the other one began. And I can see on the reference photo that that little section is a lot darker, so it looks slightly more brighter than, or more red than the rest of the orange. So I've just mixed in a little bit of that pyrrole scarlet in that color that we already had on the palette. And I want to just be careful not to go into the highlights for now that we left open. So I'm just making the side of the orange on that side a little bit darker, because we want the orange to look 3D. And by making those sides slightly darker, if you look at the reference photo, that's what will help this orange to make it look a lot more 3D than what it would be without, if it would just be a normal yellow color. I just want to take my brush and lift up the pigment that's running into that highlighted area that I want to keep light. So I'm going to wait with the other side because it's still a bit wet. So we're going to just move the pigment around on this section here while we wait. Just lift up a bit more pigment and drop some of your pigment in on the sides there. As you can see, the yellow still shines through the orange that you just painted. So that's why we always paint yellow underneath, and then we would add all the other brighter colors, especially if there's already yellow in a paint, you know, in a flower or in a vegetable. That's when you will put down your first yellow color, and then you will add all of your colors. It will just brighten up the painting, and it will shine through any color that you put down, because these are translucent watercolors that we are using. We are going to move onto the left hand side of the orange, and this is the open orange that was cut open. So that is the number 5 round brush that I have, and the other one is also around about a 5 brush, which is rounded. So the one's pointed and the red one is pointed, and then this one is rounded. So I'm just dropping in a bit more of the pyrrole scarlet or the French Sennelier color that I will mention on the supplies list. And I'm just wetting a little bit more of the yellow mixture with a drop of the orange in. And I'm just going to take my time and paint this little section of the skin of the orange. So I'm just taking my time and adding in the detail. I'm just going to be careful not to paint too close to that section there, because I still want to show that it's the skin of the orange. So I'm just being very careful not to paint too close to that other section. So I'm just moving my brush because I don't want a perfectly straight line. The orange skin is not perfect, so you don't want it perfectly round. Just follow the reference photo. Just following the reference photo, and I'm just adding in the little detail that I can see already with my brush on the orange. And on that section, that little section on the orange, you can see it, there's quite a big white section. So I'm just gonna be careful, and I want to leave it like that. And I'm just gonna wiggle my brush to make the skin look like it's not even and straight. So I can feel that the paper is dry. Don't paint on the paper when it's already wet and starting to dry. Rather wait for it to dry fully and then add the detail. So I would like to add the detail at the bottom here of this orange, because I can see that there's a very dark line there where the orange shows at the bottom, because we wanted to make it look like it's 3D. So that little dark line that you can see on the reference photo, we're going to paint in, and we're going to soften it with the number 5 brush or any round brush that you have. Then I'm going to just paint this little line that I can see on the reference photo again. I added a photo for you to use in the attachments where you find the supplies list to use, so that you can follow that and add the detail, everything that I added, if you want to use my reference photo. But you are welcome to use the reference photo that I provided for you, and you are also welcome to paint in whatever you want to paint in. So now we want to add that little bright red section that we can see on the reference photo in the middle of the orange. I'm just going to take the brush and soften those lines, wetting the top of that orange there with a clean brush. And I'm just going to drop in some of that pigment that we used earlier. So there's a little bit of orange, the yellow, a drop of the red, and still a little bit of the burnt sienna in there, but very little. I'm going to wet this, the orange, the inside of the orange now, and we're going to drop in some pigment, because we want the other side of the orange that we just painted to dry before we carry on there. I could use a bigger brush, but I want to have a little bit more control at the moment on these little sections, because some of them are different colors of orange and yellow, and you know, some have a little bit more red, some have a little bit more orange in, so that's why I'm using this brush. I'm just moving the brush around with a lot of pigment on my brush, and I'm showing you on my plate the consistency. And again, it's a different color on that side there. Now you will see as the painting dry, the color will change already. And what we will do is we'll just go back and add more color. Now I'm just dropping in a little bit of that orange mixed with the red color, because we don't want the orange to just be one color. We want it to be quite a few different colors. And you can see on the reference photo, the colors are quite different in quite a few sections. So I'm just dropping it in wherever I want to and wherever I think and can see, you know, it needs a bit more color. So we're going to wait for that to dry now before we carry on. I'm just going to move the painting because I notice it's not in the view of the camera. Just taking my time and looking at the photo and checking if everything looks fine and you know where I'm going to add more detail. So sometimes just stand up and look at your photo and squint your eyes and just see if it looks 3D. I've just got clean paper, tissue paper now, and I've got the number 5 comb brush, which is also very pointed. So I'm busy mixing the color, a little bit of the sap green. And now we're going to just add in the detail on the stem area where the stem used to be on the orange. So take your time and just add the detail slowly. I'm just softening the lines. So I'm just going to get a little bit of Payne's grey that I want to put separately on the plate, because we don't want to add too much immediately to your painting. You want to add the green slowly so it's not black. You want just it's slightly darker than what it is currently. So if you can look at the reference photo closely, you'll see that there's a little section that looks green. I'm just adding in the detail there that's in the middle of the orange, and I'm going to take my tissue paper because I just want that green to stain the paper. I don't want it to be too dark, so it's just staining that little section inside, and it looks beautiful. So I'm just picking up some pigment, and I'm going to add in those little sections on the stem that's folded. So this will make the top part of the stem, where the stem used to be, look like it's 3D by adding in all of this detail. Taking my time, and I'm just following the reference photo because I want to get that detail in as close as possible. And I'm just adding in the detail there that I can see on the reference photo. And I have a very small brush that I'm using here. You just want to add a little bit of a hard line or a darker line around that section there of the stem. So we're just adding in all of those little lines that we can see on the reference photo. And this is the permanent sub-green from Winsor & Newton that I'm using. I've just wet the big brush number 5 with clean water, and I'm just going to soften the lines ever so slightly. I'm just dabbing it with my brush. I don't want to lift the pigment up because then you have to paint it all again. I just want to soften those little hard lines that we just put down on the paper. That section needs to be darkened a little bit more, so I'm just going to add in that corner of the orange again that I can see on the reference photo. I'm going to soften the line again with our big brush. So I'm just softening the lines again. Again, we're using the big brush because we don't want to lift up most of the pigment that we already put down there. And I'm just going to darken that line that we made earlier with a little bit more burnt sienna. The mixture is already on our plate. Burnt sienna mixed with the orange and yellow mix that we already have on the plate with a red. So I just want to make that little line darker because I can see on the reference photo it's quite dark. I just want to add that little line that I can see on the orange. I just want to move the plate so you can see the colors on my palette. I've just picked up a little bit more of the yellow orange color that we have on the palette there, and I'm just painting it with my big brush with water on to wet that section again. I just want to lift up that section because I don't want to go into that highlighted area that we want to leave lighter. Just going to drop in a bit more pigment because that line is slightly hard and dark. I don't want it to be that dark, so I'm just going to soften it by wetting that because the paper is still quite wet there. So I'm just going to drop in the pigment to flow and do what it's supposed to do, because watercolor will flow where the paper is wet. So we're going to darken those little lines now, just add more detail from what we can see on the reference photo. And we're darkening those lines again, so we're just dropping in and painting more lines that we've painted earlier, but it's not dark enough. Just checking if I'm happy with that. Just going to soften it slightly. Don't want the pigment to go into that little section where I keep light. I'm just going to pick it up with my tissue paper and soften those lines there. That's it, I'm quite happy with that for now. Now that's dry, and I want to remove the masking fluid. So make sure your fingers are clean and there's no sticky stuff on, because you want to keep the area where you're removing the masking fluid, you want to be clean, no oil on your hands, because if you have oil on your hands, your watercolor paint will not go into that section where there's oil on your paper. So remember to wash your hands before you remove your masking fluid, because you want to paint in that section there. It takes some time, it's quite fun to do, and you just take your fingers and you just slide it over the masking fluid. So I added the masking fluid thickly. You'll notice a lot of times people battle to remove the masking fluid. This is quite easy to remove because I added the masking fluid quite thick, which is like a glue, so the glue just protects the paper. It's very similar to a glue, so it just protects the watercolor paper. Easy to remove. Be careful, don't damage your paper. Take your time and just move your fingers over there. You'll feel your finger will get stuck on the areas where there is masking fluid left. I'm just going to move the sticky stuff off my paper. I normally just use my big brush to pick it up, and I have a dustbin and I just sweep it into the dustbin. All of that's quite close to me, so I don't have to get up to do that. And now you can see that the whole orange section there that's supposed to be white is very white. I just want that section to dry before I remove that. And you'll see you'll battle to remove the masking fluid where some of the sections are still a bit wet. So just let your paint dry and then you remove the rest of the masking fluid. So it's still wet. I'm just going to wait a little bit before I remove that section. I haven't used it quite a lot, but it really comes in handy. And as you can see, it removes quite quickly when you take your fingers. I'm quite impressed with this brand of masking fluid. You do get more expensive ones, and the bottles are a lot smaller. This one's adequate. Honestly, it's really adequate, so you don't have to spend a fortune. Make sure you don't break your paper, though. Test it on your paper first, because I know certain watercolor papers don't allow you to use certain products on it. I use Arches watercolor paper here, so it's perfect for Arches watercolor paper, and I've used it on Fabriano before, so that the brand is quite, the paper is quite strong. So just test it on whatever brand of paper you use before you put it down, because it might damage the paper. I've put it on quite thick, and it's quite easy to move. And if you look at the orange, you'll see all the little white pieces there. It doesn't matter if you leave a little bit on the paper, but if you do lift the paper up and you let the sun shine on it or light shine on it, you'll see where there's parts where there is masking fluid, because it's got like a sheen to it, like a glue. Look how beautiful it kept that piece of highlight white. That's exactly what you want. Now, of course, you can paint around all of these highlighted sections if you prefer. It's up to you. I just found it so much easier because I really wanted to keep those highlights here, because that's what's going to make the difference in this orange painting. It's going to make it look more 3D. So I'm just mixing a little bit more yellow, and I'm going to paint it over these little highlighted sections, because we don't want it to be too bright. I'm just going to add some orange there on with my brush. I just have water on my brush, and I'm just I just dip my brush in some of the orange, and it's quite thick. So I just want to drop it in those highlights to soften those bright white areas. And because the paper is wet, it will just move nice and easy on your paper. I'm just going to take my pointy brush, the number 5 comb brush, and I'm going to just dab it around those hard lines to soften it. As you can see, it softens it quite nicely, and it still shines through, so the white bits still shine through the paper. Again, the orange with a little bit of the red mixture that was on my plate, so I'm just moving a little bit of that onto those sections there around there that I see that needs to be a little bit darker. And just soften that with your brush. I'm just going to lift some of the pigment up with the tissue paper. It already stained the paper, so I'm just want those highlights to show a little bit more than the pigment that I put down over there. I'm just using the bright yellow that I had on my plate, and I'm gonna just paint it over those highlighted sections, and you will see the highlighted sections will still shine through. So I just want it to be a little bit brighter than the color that I have on at the moment. Sorry, someone is making a noise in the garden behind us, and I want to do this voiceover because I want to upload this video shortly, so just excuse that noise in the garden. And just soften that again with your brush. So I'm taking that also over the highlighted areas that we removed the masking fluid now, and I want to make that line straight there where the orange meet the segments, or the skin of the orange meet the segments of the orange. That is Sam. Let me just go check what's going on. And I'm just brightening up again the highlights with a color that is on my palette already. And just move your brush to make it look like the little things that you can see on the orange. Just want to darken those sections. What a beautiful color. So just take your brush and soften those lines. Just want to show you the color I'm using and the consistency. It's quite watery. We obviously want to keep a lot of that light. We don't want to paint in the middle there. It's going to go a bit brighter there. So that's the yellow, just with a little drop of orange in to brighten up that color there of that orange. Just want to put a watery orange wash there to make that section darker. And soften those lines there where we dropped in that darker orange. That yellow is such a beautiful gold yellow color mixed with the orange. So it just brightens up this beautiful orange. And that highlight I just want to darken slightly. Just want to feel if that's dry before I drop in more pigment. So I've got a small brush and I'm just gonna make the little markings that I see on the reference photo. We will soften all of those a little bit later with a clean water brush. It won't be so prominent on the orange. This is really a fun part of painting in watercolor. It's adding all the detail. Of course you can also paint a lot looser and you don't have to add all the detail, but sometimes it's fun to add all of the detail. So I've dropped in a little bit of the burnt sienna with this color, just a little bit, just to make it slightly darker than the orange and the yellow. It just needed a little bit of that, I would say, rusty color. I'm dropping it all in very slowly and I'm taking my time. And as you can see, the consistency is very, very thick. And you can see also the color on my plate. It's a little drop of burnt sienna. You can hardly see it. I'm just going to stand back and see if I'm happy with my painting. Take your brush and just wet those drops that you made of the pigment there. You can see the paper is still wet. So I'm just going to drop in a little bit more of the orange color in there to soften that highlight that was so bright. And just leave the paint to do what it wants to do on the paper. So we're going to just wait for it to dry for a second. So you can take a hair dryer and you can dry your painting now. It's quite warm, a little bit warmer now, so mine will dry quite quickly. I'm going to just take a watery orange color to make those little lines that I can see on the white part of the orange. And this is a small brush. Now you can also use a white gel pen. I've seen some very nice pens that I've used for whiskers that you can buy from certain art stores, but this works very well. It's a white paint and it's not translucent, so you can paint it on. And I sometimes just take my finger and just dab onto it just to soften if it's too bright or too white. But if you stand away from your painting and you look at it, it will look 3D. If it looks weird, then it means that you added too much of this white. Go slow with the white, because you can always add more at a later stage. What's nice about this white as well is that if you wet it with a brush, you can slightly move it away. Just want to move that light out of the way, it fell. You can move it away with a wet brush and just dab it up with a tissue. So I'm just taking my time and I'm dropping in those little white sections that I can see on the reference photo. And I always drop this white onto a separate little plate because I don't want any of the yellow or the green or orange to mix with the white at this stage. So we want the paint to stay white. Take your time and just add those little white little spots. This again is the fun part of painting. I love adding all the detail. And I'm just looking at my reference photo. I don't follow it exactly. You don't have to follow it exactly. You don't have to add in all the little white spots. And also you're more than welcome to paint that in with masking fluid if you prefer. But I didn't add masking fluid everywhere. So I'm just going to use this little bit of a white paint. And a lot of artists love this white paint. Some don't, some do. It's up to you. It's whatever you want. In the end, it's what you want to add on to your painting. They normally use this white paint for their little hairs on certain flowers in botanical art. So I can highly recommend buying a small little tube and have it handy. Especially if you want to paint butterflies or little flowers or animal portraits. So I'm happy with that. I'm just looking at my painting and my reference photo to see where I can add a little bit more of this white. So stand up and look at your painting. So I'm quite happy with my painting, but I am going to add a little bit more brighter yellow on certain parts. I'm going to mix up a little bit of the azo yellow, nickel azo yellow on my painting, just to drop in a little bit of the lines to make those little segments stand out a bit more. that I went back and I added a little bit more detail because I just found it looked a bit dull. So I added in the nickel azo yellow from QOR Watercolours. You can find it in other brands. It's a beautiful, beautiful yellow. I am using it in a lot of my art. So if you can buy this yellow, buy a small tube. It will last you a very long time. So I'm just adding in all those little dots that you can see on the orange, and as you can see, it already looks so much different, so much more 3D. I'm just dropping in, just want to see these little sections that looks like the segments of the orange. And as you can see, I'm leaving little openings to make it look like little segments of the orange, and it just looks so much better already. I'm quite happy with it. As you can see, the color looks like a quinacridone gold, but it's nickel azo yellow. It's quite bright. If you put it on the paper like I just did now, I'm just going to soften it with another brush with a little bit of water. And I'm just going to move it, and it becomes this beautiful, beautiful golden color. So take a small little brush and just add the detail as you go along. I'm not looking at the reference photo necessarily now. I'm just adding in the little segments as I go along. So the other parts that I'm not dropping in this paint, different colors are shining through. And it just makes it look so much better. It would look so bland if I didn't add in all this beautiful yellow colors now. I'm even going on over some of those white little highlights that I left open there, because some of them are a little bit too bright. And just wet your pigment all the time and drop in more color. So I'm taking my time. This is so much fun to paint. So again, I can highly recommend this yellow. It's a beautiful color. You will not be sorry. So again, buy a small little tube. You will definitely use this color again. And as you can see, I'm just dabbing little lines on the paper with my brush. They're not all equal little lines. They're just little squiggly little things that look like little segments. It's quite pretty. And some are slightly darker than others. So I'm just carrying on adding all the detail. I will go back and add more detail over some of the lines, and you will see that the colors at the bottom will always shine through. So I'm taking my time, and it takes quite a while, but all of these little segments will make this orange look so much more 3D and like a real orange. You'll see when you're done. So take your time and add the detail, because it will be beautiful when you're finished. And I'm still using the number 5 comb pointed brush to make these little lines. I think if you use a round brush here, it will be too big and it won't add, except if you maybe squeeze the brush between your hands while it's wet and you dip it in your paint and you use little side way, you use the brush sideways. But if a big brush will not get the detail that you want for these segments. So if the brush is too round and too fat, it will not get all the beautiful segmented details that you want for this painting, for the orange segments. As you can see, the lines look perfect. It really look like little segments. So that's what you want to achieve. So try and use one of your thinnest pointy brushes or pointed brushes that you have, and instead of maybe a big brush, or maybe even a smaller brush will do. So I'm going back and I'm just adding more color where the paint dried and it's too light. And I just go back and forth with my brush all the time. And I check if the paint is dry, because I don't want to lift up all the other paint that I already added earlier. I also want to add a little bit of this color on the skin of the orange, so I'm just dropping it in and making these little lines with my paintbrush. So I'm leaving little sections open, but I'm just dropping in this beautiful color because it just brightens up this whole orange color that I had underneath there. And I'm slightly going into the white sections that we left open with the masking fluid that covered the paper. And I'm just gonna finish this section here. I'm slightly going into that section that's quite a big white part of the orange that I just want to make slightly smaller. I'm just gonna add a drop in the middle there to brighten up that color, the middle of the orange, and a little bit of dots on the white in the middle center of the orange. We're now going to move on to the big orange. Also, to brighten up that color, I'm just going to add the detail. I'm not following the reference photo necessarily here. I'm just adding in markings that looks like you would see on the orange. So again, I'm not following, you don't have to follow the reference photo, but add detail in that you want on your orange. I'm also going in some of the white parts that are too white, that I don't want to be too white or too highlighted. I'm just dropping in some of the paint everywhere. So just carry on adding all the detail until you're happy with your orange. So I'm just going to show you how I drop in these little markings on the orange. So it's just little dots that I drop down, and I'm just wiggling my brush and carry on. It's fun. So you can follow what I do, or you can just follow what you want to do on as you follow the reference photo, and add the detail of what you can see on the reference photo. This is going to take some time, so I'm just going to sit back and relax and just add the detail. So in some places I just make little lines, as you can see there. Some places I just squiggle with a little brush. Some places I just make little dots. You don't want it all to look exactly the same, so do what you see on the reference photo or what you want. And as you can see, the beautiful color is still shining through at the bottom. This color that we add is just adding another dimension to your watercolor painting, and it brightens up certain sections, so it looks like the light is shining on that little section that we just painted there. We still leave the highlights open, but we're just covering some of them. Now if you stand back, you will see that the orange just looks more and more like a real orange. These markings really make a difference to this orange. And some parts are thicker than others, and the consistency is very, very thick. Some are more watery, and I'm just adding in as I go along, wetting the pigment all the time. As you can see, all that yellow is gone. I've used all of my yellow on my plate. Just going over that white highlighted section there. I'm just going to add a little bit more markings that I can see on the reference photo, and like I say, I'm not following the exact markings on the orange. I'm just adding the detail as I'm looking at it. I'm just going to use the pigment that I have on my brush and just want to brighten up that little section at the bottom there. So while I'm finishing up all the detail, I just want to thank you for joining me in this tutorial, this little orange tutorial that we've just done. It's like an orange study, and I'm going to show you how your orange should look now when you're finished with it.